a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. Nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. The nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the 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 nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. Nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. The nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare. It was a nightmare, the 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 nightmare. It was a nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare, the nightmare.